Welcome back. I'm Rob Seeley, the pastor at Cherokee Presbyterian Church, and I'm so glad you've joined us as we continue our study of Paul's letter to the Romans. Now we're in the next part of here in this part we're studying today. We're getting into chapter 9 of the book of Romans, and in this part Paul begins to take up the question of who is saved. And this question actually going to take up 3 chapters in Paul's book of Romans. Chapters 9, 10, 11 deal in some degree, in part or in whole, with this question of who is saved and who receives salvation. Now, it is a complicated question. It takes a while to answer, which is why Paul spends so much time, or dedicates so much time, to answering this question. He is in fact tackling one of the great mysteries of God about who is saved and who is not. A question that most of us at some point have asked. Now, it's important to note that at the end of chapter 11, Paul ends the chapter, and he ends this whole discussion about salvation with saying that there's so much about God that is mysterious. There's so much that we will never understand about him. And that's appropriate to remember as we begin our conversation about salvation. There is so much about God we do not understand. There's so much of his works that is a mystery. And that is very true about this conversation we have here. So we need to bear in mind as we study this that there is a great mystery in the study of salvation. There is a great mystery to the workings of God. And there's a great mystery always when we human beings begin to approach the mind of God. So let's bear that in mind as we begin this next section of Paul's letter to Romans. So what I want you to do is open your Bibles up, look at chapter 9, and we're going to read all of chapter 9, verses 1 to 33. Now when you read this, I want you to focus primarily on verses 6 to 24. Read the whole thing, maybe pay a little closer attention, 6 to 24. So pause this video, take a minute, read through that section on Romans, make any notations or notes about what seems important to you in this verse. And then when you're done, hit play again, and we'll start back up. All right, well, hopefully you've had time to read through chapter 9 and focus on verses 6 to 24, and hopefully you're able to gain some new insights on what Paul's talking about here. Paul begins, he takes up this subject which we call the idea of election. And what election means is that some have been chosen for salvation while others have not been chosen. Now, if you've ever read through the Bible or you're familiar with the history of the church and history of the Bible, this shouldn't come as a foreign concept. We must remember that the Israelite people, God's people, were chosen. They were chosen to be God's people. This wasn't by their effort, but this was by God's design, by his grace, or what we would call by God's election and God's choice. And so this is not a foreign concept. Paul's taking a concept that we've understood from the Old Testament, and now he's going to apply it in a broader range to a broader group of people. And if he opens up this discussion here in chapter 9, he opens up this discussion by wishing that his own people, that the Israelites, that all of them were saved. And he even says that he would give his own salvation, give himself over completely in order that his brothers and sisters, his fellow Israelites, would be saved. So he mourns the fact that many of those have rejected the grace of God, and they've done so by rejecting Jesus Christ. And now, while many of the Israelites, and especially maybe some Jewish Christians, would probably argue against Paul and say that all Jews are going to be saved because they are after all, the chosen people. And being the chosen people, by definition, they will be saved. Paul disagrees with this, and this is his answer, picking up in verse 6. He says, "For not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel, and not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. But through Isaac shall your offspring be named. This means that it is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. For this is what the promise said, about this time next year I will return, and Sarah shall have a son." And what Paul means by this when he's saying here is that it's got to be more than just a genetic descendancy in order to be the children of God, to be the chosen, to be the children of the promise. And what he reminds us is that when he says that it's through Isaac the offspring shall be named, and it's through Isaac that the chosen people will be named or be called the chosen. He reminds us of this because Abraham had two sons. If you remember from the story in Genesis, Abraham actually had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. But he says it's through the son Isaac that Israel will be named the people of God. And it's not through Ishmael. And it's only those from Isaac are the ones that are going to be considered the chosen ones. And this means it's not descent from Abraham that makes you chosen. If it was merely relationship to Abraham, if it was only that you can say Abraham was our forefather, then the children of Ishmael would be considered the chosen as well. But he says it's not this way. It's only those that are descended from Isaac that are considered the chosen ones, that are considered those that are saved. So it doesn't matter if you're descended from Abraham or not. What matters is that you were descended from the promise. That it was the promise of God that made them chosen, not descendancy from Abraham. In other words, it's the promise of God that grants you salvation. It's not the fact that you're related to anybody that you can say you're the chosen people or you belong to Israel. You've got to be descended by the one to whom the promise was given. So it was the promise of God that makes the chosen, not the fact that you're descended from Abraham. And this idea is further reinforced here in verse 10, where he says, "And not only so, but also when Rebekah had conceived children by one man, our forefather Isaac, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. She was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated." And so to further reinforce this idea that it's election and that it's God's choice and the promise that makes you the chosen people, he gives the example of Esau and Jacob. There's also a story from Genesis. Now Esau was the older brother and Jacob was the younger one. And by tradition and by the laws of the land, the older was the one that was supposed to receive the blessing. And so it should have been through Esau that all of Israel was descended, but God turned it around. He turned it up on his head. It was Jacob, the younger one, that was to receive the blessing. He was the one through whom all of Israel would be descended. Now, why did he do this? Paul says he did this in order that his purpose of election might be made manifest. And it's not the works of the flesh, it's not the works that we do that grant us salvation, and it's not the works that we do that continue God's work. It's what he does in us. It has to be that way to show that it was his election. That's what he says. Let's look at verse 11 again. It says, he does these things. He made the younger rule over the older in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. This whole system of salvation, Paul's saying, it doesn't depend on works. It depends solely and exclusively on the call of God. So it is election that makes salvation. It's election that makes us saved. It is God choosing us or God choosing you. That's why Isaac was the father of Israel. He was chosen to be. Why Esau ended up serving Jacob and all of Israel was descended from Jacob, because he was chosen to be. It wasn't by tradition, and it wasn't the way that you would have thought it been. It was the way that God chose it to be. So being chosen in salvation then depends on God. It depends on his purpose, which we call election, him choosing us. Now, when we hear this, our initial reaction is to think that this is a bit unfair, that God chooses some and our effort doesn't have anything to do with it. Well, Paul has an answer for this right there in verse 14. He says, "What then shall we say? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." What he's saying is God reserves the right to show mercy to anybody he wants to. That is his right. He will show mercy who he wants to show mercy, and he will even harden the heart of whoever he desires, or whoever he will harden the heart of. He's God. He's God. It's his salvation. and God is going to save whoever He wants. We can call this the divine prerogative. Life is from God, salvation from God. All these things are belong to Him, and they're from Him. So of course He reserves the right, and He has the right to give that mercy to whomever He wants. Now this still might seem a little unfair to us. We might complain, and they say, if it's God's choice, who gets saved and who doesn't, then who can blame evil people for being evil? It's really not their fault at all. Only reason that the good are good is because they're chosen. The only reason the evil are going to be evil is because they're not chosen. So you really can't find fault with them at all. In fact, you might even have to find fault with God. Paul answers this in the following verses, starting in 19. He says, "You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist His will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show His wrath and to make known His power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of His glory for vessels of mercy, which He has prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom He has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles." And Paul's saying quite simply, who are you now to question God? And who are you to question what God does? And he gives us this analogy of a potter and a lump of clay. And he says the potter, as he's shaping this clay, he has a right to do with the clay whatever he wants to. It's his clay, it's his labor, it's his workshop. He can make whatever pot he wants. If he wants to make a pot that he creates and then he breaks on the ground, he can do that. If he wants to make another pot and decide to use that for something honorable, he can do that too. He owns the clay. He can make it for whatever purpose he desires. So we, of course, are that clay in this analogy. We're the clay, and God is the potter. He has shaped us for whatever purpose that God desires. And therefore, it is His right to make us for whatever purpose He wants, and then to do with us whatever He wants to do, even if that means making us for destruction. Now, for most of us modern Americans, we are a people that are very aware of our rights. We're very aware of our dignity, about what can and can't be done to us. And we might take a lot of umbrage at this, take a lot of offense, and say this is an idea that's pretty hard to swallow. And I got to admit, it is an idea that's very hard to swallow. It's very hard to come to terms with this, about someone out there that's got total and absolute rights over us. And we don't have any ground to stand on to complain. But it's true. It's absolutely true. God is our maker, and He can create us for whatever purpose He desires. Being God, He absolutely has that right. But for those that are in Christ, it is He created us for this purpose, and that is to exalt those that He has made for glory. He has made some for glory. He has chosen some and set them aside, elected them for glory, and He will exalt those that He made for glory. And He says this in verse 23. It says, "In order to make known the riches of His glory for vessels of mercy, which are the saved, which He has prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom He has called, not from the Jews only, but also for the Gentiles." Some of these vessels that God has created, Paul is saying, some of them, which are some people, have been made from glory. For glory. They're made to be glorified one day. And not only were they made for glory, but it says He prepared them. He prepared them for glory, it says, beforehand. And that's where we get this idea of predestination from. So not only were we chosen to be God's people, but Paul says we were chosen beforehand. And by that we mean sometime in the distant past. And later in Ephesians, Paul mentions that we were predestined before God laid the foundations of the earth. So that is probably this beforehand that Paul is talking about here in Romans. Before He even created this earth, He prepared us. He prepared those that are saved to be vessels of glory, elected, chosen by God for glory. And so what we see here is God shaping this new Israel, this new chosen people. And they're made not just from the Israelites, they're going to be made from the Gentiles as well. And all these things that are operating here, those that are saved in this new Israel, is all going to be operated by God's sovereign choice. Remember, it was God that chose ancient Israel, the Israelites of the Old Covenant. It was God's choice to pick those people. And in the same way, God today, God now, not only when Paul's writing in Romans, but to this very day as we live and breathe in this generation, God is choosing a new Israel. And He is forming us as people of His new covenant. So whether you're talking about the Old Covenant or whether you're talking about the New Covenant, the chosen people, the saved people, are always chosen by God's sovereign choice. Not by our works, not by the things that we do, but by God's mercy and by God's choice. And so we can understand then completely that salvation belongs to the elect. It belongs only to the elect, those that have been chosen. And it is that those that are chosen are an Israel not of flesh, not a descent from Abraham, but a children of the Spirit of God. Those that are sealed by His Spirit, and those that have been have had the blood of Christ poured into them, and those are the people He's making a new Israel out of, a new group of chosen people. So now as we move forward in chapter 10, Paul is going to explain now how this message of salvation, this message of the new Israel, is going to go out into the whole world. And there we find out very quickly that this idea of elect is much bigger than we are, and it's much bigger than we expect. Well, that's it for chapter 9. Hope you learned something. Hope you got a little bit out of our discussion here. So what I encourage you to do is continue to read, though, in chapter 9, maybe read a little bit ahead to chapter 10. But as you read chapter 9, I want you to ask yourself a question. And this is just a very normal question for us human beings to ask when we tackle a doctrine like election and salvation by God's choice and not by our works. And I want you to ask yourself this: is it unfair if God has chosen some for salvation, but He has not chosen others? Is it unfair if God has chosen some for salvation, but not others? I want you to read back through verses 6 to 24 and read those again to look for the answer to that question. And hope you enjoyed this segment. Like I said, hope you learned a little bit, and hope to see you for the next one.